Hi, so today we're going to look at the principles of design and what design means as a term in art. Let me pull up the slides here now. So if we're going to understand art, we need to first dive deeper into the study of organization, essentially. We've looked at the elements of art, now let's look at the arrangement of those elements, those components, and that's called design. What is designing? So design can mean a lot of things. To conceive, invent, contrive, form a plan for, draw a sketch, have as a goal or purpose, or to intend. A visual composition, a pattern, so there design is a noun. A reasoned purpose or intention. So the most common definition would be to prepare a preliminary sketch or the plans for work to be executed, especially to plan the form and structure of something. So we design the plans for this chair. And the word is both a noun and a verb. When we attempt to arrange parts in a way that is most efficient or attractive and meaningful, we're engaged in the process of design. But I could say something like, I'm designing a design. And it still makes sense grammatically. That's because design could be a verb and a noun at the same time. So the result of the activity, which may be an intellectual property as well as a sketch or model, is also called a design. So that's the idea of it being a noun as well. And design is happening everywhere. It's happening right now. So these words were chosen to look this way. I designed these sentences to look like this. I designed your slideshows to look the way they are. And so we might say that the key to design is planning. And then how is the artist different from anyone else that plans? Well, artists plan the arrangement of the elements to form a visual image or object. And we should kind of do a little tangent here and define the difference between two words, fine art and applied art. So applied art might integrate functionality or utility as equally or more important than aesthetics, while fine art usually holds the aesthetic attributes as the most important thing. So here's an example of pure applied design without any aesthetic consideration. We would call this a utilitarian object, a pure utilitarian object. So there's not color chosen here. There's not aesthetic design chosen here. Everything here is for a very concrete purpose. Might say the same thing about a paperclip. Um, a bare metal paperclip like this is purely utilitarian. You know, if we've got a paperclip that's got paint on it, that's like pink, then it has some consideration for aesthetics put into the design. And applied art is also concerned with visual design in its own ways. So these are Corinthian columns, and the primary purpose of these is for structural support. So their utility in holding up a building, but then they're decorated, so they have aspects of fine art. Stained glass, the primary purpose is to let in light, but it's also artistically designed. So we could say the following are examples of applied art, but they also have some visual concerns as well, but primarily they're functional, like advertisements or commercial art, book covers, furniture, architecture, product design or packaging, web design, game design. I will say that though there is something called conceptual or abstract architecture, which seeks just to design architecture for itself, and there's not consideration for using it for actual purposes. So that might be a venture into fine art with architecture. Game design is something interesting. Is it primarily aesthetic or is it primarily functional? And I would say that it's primarily functional as entertainment, really. And then the art, so to speak, is put on top of the mechanics of the game. And then we've got fine art. So here, the most important thing, this is a Caravaggio painting, by the way, and the woman is getting back at him for a rape. So we're seeing a very brutal scene, especially for the era in which this was painted. But this is an example of fine art. So the primary purpose is visual. It doesn't have functional aims other than to relay its content. So it's not like this is first and foremost to hold up a wall or something. This is first and foremost a painting. So it's fine art. What about this? What about memes? I mean, this is an interesting category, kind of like comics or other jokes, really, that are written down. Um, we have this sort of middle ground between fine art and applied art. So it's got this functionality of making you laugh, but the visual aspect has to be there as well. So this is a really interesting thing to consider is whether or not memes are something that is fine art, and we should call meme creators artists, or is it a functional art? Is it purely entertainment? So maybe there's this separate category for humor or memes. And so graphic novels, comics, and cartoons all sit somewhere in between this. Our primary concern then in this class is fine art. We'll also occasionally, like right now, see notable examples of applied art with strong visual attributes. So this is by a Russian constructivist named Malevich. And I love this poster. But it definitely reflects an artistic movement that was happening at the time in which it was made. So this hits that balance point between being functional, so selling things, and being fine art. So an easy chair on the left is definitely functional, applied art, while the painting on the right is fine art. And so aesthetically, the result is always visual organization. And remember that discussing art, a distinction should be made between content and form. And I know I've hit that over the head, but we've really got to have that separation. Content, the broad term that refers to the message, narrative, meaning, or subject of the work. Form is the purely visual aspect, manipulation of various elements and principles of design that is a designing part of art. Content is what the artist wants to say. Form is how they say it. In a case of work like this, I have no idea what the artist, me, was trying to say because for me, content and form are really wrapped up together. So this is more about just the form and less about some specific content. This is more about the aesthetic experience itself. Sometimes form is the content. So we've talked about the elements, we went all through those, and now we're going to talk about the principles of design. And the way that the principles and elements interact is how we get to design. So we can think of the elements as the parts and pieces, and their interaction or their behavior is what the principles of design are. So we might have a red square on one side of a painting and a similar red square on the other kind of the paint side of the painting, And we would say that the painting is balanced symmetrically because of that. So calling something a square and naming its color was all about the elements we studied. But when I talked about balance, I was talking about one of the principles of design. The elements are the characteristics, principles are the behaviors of those characteristics. And here they are: contrast, emphasis, movement, balance, proportion or scale, rhythm and pattern, and unity and variety. So let's take a look at contrast. Contrast means different, of course. Differences between the elements. It can happen between any of the elements. Um, this sculpture shows us contrast between shapes, circular elements contrasting the overall rectangular shape. And we see contrasting color a little bit. The lower half is a darker gray than the upper half. And just in the scene alone, we see contrast of the green grass and the gray sky. And here we're seeing contrast of texture. So you can see the backs of all these figures are all sort of furry and rough, whereas the ground they're sat upon is smooth. And so we see that contrast between textures. And so contrast doesn't have to be about shapes, doesn't have to be about value, doesn't have to be about color. It can be about any of those elements. Here we've got contrast of value, so black and white, and we've got contrast of color. Contrast of value is a very famous image. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Let's look at emphasis. And emphasis is the highlighting or popping out of specific areas in a work. And so emphasis is often achieved through contrast, but also through combinations of the elements. These words contrast their background, thus they pop out and are emphasized. So they contrast in both value and color. They contrast value-wise by the brightness of the words and the darkness of the purple background. Um, and then they're white and purple. So there's contrast happening, and that's what's causing the emphasis. And we'll see this a lot across artworks where principles are working together to create each other. We've got emphasis through color, value, contrast, and size, proportion and scale, and positioning. And we'll see when we look at composition later in another lecture that her positioning, her head, is purposefully put there in what's called a portrait triangle. And so it draws our eyes right to where her head is. So our eyes go to her head first, and then secondarily we see the monkey. So she's emphasized. Emphasis through color and value, contrast, and positioning of the elements. This is a really brutal scene. It's of a man being attached to cars with chains. This is Kienholz built this scene. It's called an installation. That means that it's a sculpture set up with multiple parts. If you want to look at this scene further, you can in the slideshow, but this is a really dramatic view of emphasis happening. All of the lights are shining right onto the central characters, and we can see that that part of the scene is emphasized. That's where our eyes are meant to be drawn. Emphasis through color contrast and symmetry and asymmetry relationship. So we can see that most of this image is symmetrical in its drawing, essentially. but it's not truly symmetrical because the red and green flip places throughout. So those flipping of places create different relationships between the red and the green, and we get emphasis of all those places where that swapping happens. And of color contrast is happening here as well. Emphasis through contrast of color and pattern. So this figure sticks out or is emphasized by him being a complete figure put against a wallpaper background. He sticks out, he pops out, so he's emphasized. And that's how meaning is often projected in a work. He stands out from the normal pattern, becomes something important via the emphasizing of his difference. All right, let's look at movement. So movement is the actual kinetic movement of an object, so a car driving down a street, or the depiction of movement, so a drawing of movement, or the movement our eyes take when we're looking at that drawing. So three different things movement can be: actual kinetic movement, the depiction of movement, or the movement that our eyes take, our eyes moving around the painting. This is a proto-cubist drawing. It's actually a futurist drawing. The futurists were pretty interesting. Um, when we hear the word futurist today, it's really used kind of wrong. The futurists were all about progress no matter what. So they thought that warfare was a good thing. Um, they would make manifestos about how war was good because it ended up in progress. And the kind of morbidly funny thing is, most of them signed up for World War One because they believed in war, and most of them were killed in World War One. So it kind of got back to them. Unlike emphasis, movement comes from the other principles. It's the appearance of action in a work, or the directing of our eyes, or the actual action we already mentioned, by elements and principles in the work. So we've got big curving lines meeting straight lines, causing our eyes to constantly go back and forth between these straight angled lines and these curved lines. And see here, movement is taking place by the way our eyes are moving around the scene. So maybe at first you see the central figure, and then your eyes move upwards to what's happening in the heavens. So, and then maybe you go down to the bottom of the scene. So our eyes are moving all over the scene, and we're getting movement through our eye movement. De Kooning's work. This is very gestural drawing. So we're seeing movement happening through the action of the artist making the work. A lot going on here. The line work and the contrast of color is causing a lot of sporadic movement happening throughout this painting. And then we've got movement through contrast of values and colors, jagged line work, and emphasis. So again, all of these design principles and elements all work together. They're not mutually exclusive of one another. There's a lot happening here that our eye has to go around the scene to sort of read this scene. So click this link and watch this Borowski sculpture happening. There's a Borowski sculpture outside of the Seattle Art Museum, a really large one where you can see kinetic movement. So watch this scene, and I think this may be the same video, maybe not. Watch this next video as well. All right. See you next time.